Welcome to Inside New York's Art World. I'm Barbara Lee Diamondstein, and our guest today is painter, filmmaker, video artist, saxophonist, Larry Rivers. I'm especially pleased to have you join us. About 15 years ago, a major magazine carried an important story about the work of Larry Rivers. That was done by writer Larry Rivers. It starts with a self-introduction.
Oh, yeah.
It touches on all sorts of things. You told about what interests you, what can never satisfy you, some of your immediate responses to your work, some history. I wonder, in fact, of all the pieces that I've read about you, I thought it was the most eloquent and the most objective. I wonder if we could start today by your doing a similar thing. How would you describe your work?
Okay, we can start by kind of a little social history, I guess. I was a musician to begin with. I think that I took piano as a kid, very young, and my father could play violin just well enough to, he was from sort of Poland, Russia. He could play sort of those dances like mazurkas and polkas and kazakhskas and shares and all that. And he actually had a very quick way of teaching me how to accompany him, which always felt much more thrilling, I'm afraid, than, you know, practicing and trying to get something that maybe was Bach or Beethoven, whatever it is. And so I accompanied him. So in a way, he kind of killed piano in a serious way. So, but I like doing what I did, but I took up saxophone. Okay, at 12, saxophone, and that carried me through into my 20s. And
you were a professional musician.
Yeah, I actually traveled with bands during that big band era. And
any well-known bands?
Well, there were, I don't know if anybody remembers any of those bands, like Jerry Wald and Herbie Fields and Johnny Morris and Georgie Auld. I mean, like sort of bands that were pretty well known. And friends of mine would be with Tommy Dorsey one week, and then they'd be in the band I'm playing with. I had that kind of a background, and for a kid, I was actually, because if you doubled on clarinet, and like we played the Low East State when it was like, had vaudeville, so you, for a kid, I mean, 180 bucks a week in the 40s was like, and we lived around in hotels, and you got away from mom or the girl you married or whatever it was, and so I considered myself a professional musician, and there was a time we were up in Maine, and we had one of those jobs where you stay in the town for really for a while. We had a 3-week thing, and my first exposure to modern art, I guess, or art from a personal point of view, was that the pianist, a man called Jack Freilicke, actually, married a girl called Jane Freilicke, and thought for 3 weeks, well, maybe you should have her along for all the usual reasons men might want to have their wives along with them. And she came up, and all the guys in the band played cards during the day, and I was somehow didn't like that. It seemed to be boring. And we began sort of doing what was called modern art, doing modern art. We'd sit at a table in the afternoon, so when they were playing cards, we'd do some things, and I first started to, and I think, though, then I used to go for walks alone with her, and she was very smart. She was like the first girl I met that it was mixed. Aside from being a girl, she seemed to have a brain, and I could talk to her. I don't know. I had all the usual 40s attitudes, I suppose. She was the first girl I knew who didn't wear high heels. I did remember that. And that sort of made an impression. I thought it was sort of corny and unattractive at first, but it made me look at her in another way. I mean, I finally had to sort of realize that she was something other than some sex object. And I began reading, and this girl was very important in my becoming interested in art. And she decided, and we knew, Snell Blaine actually, I think, had been a Hoffman student, and I started to go to Hoffman. Well, that was, I think, the beginning. I enjoyed it for a while. I think one day there was one girl that was so beautiful that we actually sent a petition around to keep her for an extra week. And I think that I also decided at that point that I want to learn how to draw. I'm sorry, with your rectangles and this, he would talk about push and pull, and I think at a certain point he gave up with me. He'd come around, he'd kind of laugh a little, he'd look at it, he said, has a certain kind of psychological impact, but he was kind of nice. He actually more or less left me alone. And I think life took its various turns, and you know how upset people can be in their 20s, and I went through all the ups and downs that people do about love and life, and who am I and what am I, and who loves me and who do I love and all that. And I think that I finally moved away by myself, was painting down on the east side.
Did you continue to play?
Music I continued playing. I was broke, relatively broke. I actually was one of those people who was receiving $20 a week at that time. It was called the 21 Club.
5220. For 20 weeks,
yes.
veterans
$20
received
a week.
52. 52 weeks, veterans received $20.
I actually had, when I got out of the Army, I got out earlier than most people, like various reasons, and nothing very mysterious. And I went to Juilliard under the special thing called Public Law 16, which meant to be rehabilitated. It wasn't the GI Bill, which was something else, which was to do with the amount of time you served, and then you'd get free education. They had a program called rehabilitation, which meant that you can go to school as long as it took to get you to a point where you could somehow manage with society and support yourself. Well, I stayed there and I had a great time. I met Miles Davis, was going to school at that time, and used to come in every day and tell me about things. He lived with Charlie Parker, and so all those days I met a lot of interesting people. I always felt as if I was in some kind of excitement, I must admit. And but then I went to Hoffman, a year and a half of that, and didn't go to school anymore, and painted on my own.
When did you begin to show?
Well, that was very strange. I don't know if it had to do with the time, or had to do with my personality, or had to do with my work. I would say I had my first show in 1949. I think I began Hoffman in the fall of 47, 48, to have had a show. Not only did I have a show so quickly, but I was reviewed by Clem Greenberg. That article, to his embarrassment, still exists, in which he said that I was already better than Bonnard. I don't know if you came across that in your research, but considering our personal history after that, I think that he would like to have that suppressed. But anyway, it's another whole other story. Anyway, I did have that show at the Jane Street Gallery, and it was a cooperative. Like, all the artists chipped in a few bucks, something like that. But it was up on Madison Avenue, and I think my work at that time was a lot out of Bonnard. I liked him, a lot of nice, beautiful colors. It didn't seem to require I mean, my early notion of it didn't seem to require a kind of technical know-how. And I think I had some dreamy idea about France, and I was going to sort of translate American experience into a post-impressionist period. It's a kind of silly thing, but I did it for a while. And he was quite strong for a long time. And he is a beautiful painter, but I've changed my idea of why he's beautiful. And then I think perhaps...
Can you describe that change? Yes.
Well, I see that he's much more peculiar than I thought he was. I mean, while he may be beautiful, and it seems to be about places and like how beautiful landscapes look, or plates on tables and people in sunlit rooms, it seems to, actually, when you begin to examine it, it's like a fantastic sort of interest in what makes some object look like it does. I mean, there are like 50,000 colors in this thing. He was an amazing man. He kept pushing in these colors that you would think would never work. There are blacks and reds. It seems much odd. And he also would stick an arm in from a corner of the painting that by just keep going at it, it seemed to feel as if it worked and fit.
And in 1954 and 5, the drawings of nudes that you had really represented the first major attack on abstract expressionism.
Well, I think they occurred, yeah, didn't, sometimes I thought of that. I'll tell you when I thought of that more. Say, by the 51, 52, I was probably feeling my outs more. You know, you feel at 26, 27, you really think that you're getting old or that you understand or whatever. There's some point there, hit it, zoning in on 30 that you really feel as if this is the time to really be serious. And I went out to the Hamptons with Helen Frankenfeld, actually, who was a...
You had just moved there. Didn't you move to Southampton?
No, that was
along
before I
about
moved there.
53?
It may have been one of the reasons. The Hamptons have a very strange, you know, they have a history of having been, I think, William Chase, had an art school there at the turn of the century. And it was an art, it was a combination of society and art. And I think during the 40s, a lot of the surrealists who came from France and American painters somehow went out there. I don't know why. It was cheap. It was close enough to New York. You could paint, whatever. Pollock was out there. And while I may not have been a great admirer of Pollock, I think I admire the fact that he was an artist. I mean, that he did this thing and did it all the time and was very serious, did very large canvases, had a barn in which he painted. So there is where I began. Now, after about 2 years after that, Pollock now became a kind of hero and a darling of the set out there, and even though he, to the general public, may not have been that well known, he began to be touted very strongly, and the whole thing of abstract painting, which was called abstract expressionism, began to be the only thing that seemed to interest people. Everything else was sort of thought of as retrogressive or conservative or somehow wrong. And I think that the works that were termed avant-garde were really in some way related to probably an idea of revolution. I guess that a very simple-minded way of really looking at it, I think today, might have been that there was, I think, the painting that was like publicly popular at the time that people like de Kooning and Pollock, maybe Klein thing, the painting that was popular, I think, were WPA or social realist painting, I meant, that it was all tied up with the role of socialist thought in America, I think, in politics, and that there was something about that these people had no part in. It's a simple way of looking at it, but on the other hand, I think that I thought to myself that I don't have that. In other words, I'm not rebelling against social realism. I mean, or I don't feel that something about that is old hat or had to be destroyed. I didn't even think about it. But I was confronted with Pollock on a social aesthetic level. Now, later on, people started doing things. That painting, Washington Cross in Delaware, inspired a lot of my friends. Alva Leslie did a thing called Custer's Last Stand. I mean, like, you know, a month later. Someone did Henry Ford standing next to his first Ford, which was not on the scene at that time, particularly.
What Mr. Rivers is making reference to is really one of his most important contributions, and that is the use of iconographic cliches of present-day life. For example, historical events, banknotes, the reworking of popular paintings, advertising images. All of these things, including Washington crossing the Delaware, the Dutch masters' paintings, were painted along about 1953, well before the pop art movement. Do you see any connection between your work
Pop art
and the influence and its influence on that movement?
I tell you, sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. I don't know. If I were to tell you, I think we discussed this once before. Now, when I say that, you said before the nudes pitted itself against abstract expressionism. I wanted to give a more accurate pinpointing of when I felt what you just spoke about, which I think was more to do with Washington crossing the Delaware. While it may have sounded like I was presenting this as if I'm going to think up some idea that's really going to harass or upset abstract expressionists, that's not true. I told you that I had a fairly broad, pompous streak, and what I mean, it was sort of related to literature. I had, I think, been ill, and I was reading War and Peace. War and Peace hit me like a bomb. I thought that War and Peace was sort of like, that and Proust was like the Michelangelo of literature. I just thought that it was really an extraordinary work, an extraordinary experience, and like fantastic structure. So I actually thought that Washington Cross in Delaware was my kind of getting into the ring with Tolstoy. I really thought that I interpreted the War and Peace as a work based on a fairly known aspect of national history. I mean that the Russians, all Russians knew about the invasion of Moscow, and that maybe even, it didn't even happen that much earlier than the book, let's say 50 years before the book was written. And the repercussions from it were felt all through Russia, and I think that he kind of, I don't want to say cashed in, but he used that as the basis of it, and that alone would be of great interest. And I think that I tried to think of it as a painting equivalent. And of course, my nature is different. I just thought of Washington Cross in Delaware, which actually was always considered to be a kind of joke in American society.
Is
not the paintings, but the idea of it. For some reason, all high school, little public school plays were sort of based on it. You found out about it. It seemed to be like a kind of where Napoleon's invasion of Moscow seemed like to be a serious part of European history and the movement of kings and the change from certain kinds of society one to another. While one could say that about Washington Cross in Delaware, it's somehow, because I experienced it more directly, I thought it was sort of funny, really, Washington Cross in Delaware.
what determines quality and meaning in a painting?
I don't know, but I sort of just go on what interests me, and I have the painting can be thought of as like there are a lot of radials or spokes, one of those and that each one of them has some kind of interest for me. I mean, I said that I felt the thing about Tolstoy, well, and War and Peace. I was going to be America's War and Peace painter. I also felt that fuck the idea that you can't have subject matter. I mean, I just thought that I heard enough of it. I felt that if a man could actually put down paint falling off a brush, there's some sort of ego or balls involved, and I thought to myself, I'll do this, and who's to tell me that I can't do it? And I was interested in it.
I want to come back to you, especially what critics have always said about you, and that is that you were a born draftsman and a powerful and painterly technician.
There were early works where I painted and I drew in it with charcoal. Now, although I've had a lot of criticism, people finally telling me, well, you know, the airbrush, it looks very impersonal, and I don't know, Larry, what happened to that other thing, that hand of yours? It really was nice. And so at first you try to kind of say, okay, how long can you keep something up? I mean, maybe it would look nice and things like, I want to try something different. But maybe there is something about it that is, I don't know, cold or something. But so I feel now I want to get into a thing where I actually draw and use the airbrush. So I'm at the brink of what I consider to be a new period. I'm going to try something of that. So I have to make a drawing first these days, and which now suddenly seems very traditional. It used to be that I would just jump in. I would start to paint. Now I seem to want to know more what's going to happen.
When are you sure that a painting is right?
When am I sure? I don't think I am. I keep going, I keep filling in, like, I'm going to do that. I more or less tell myself what I'm going to do. I'm going to make this thing. Like, say I'm starting this thing with the Polish rider. Well, I'm going to have a horse in it, and I'm going to have a man on top of the horse, and there's a landscape behind this rider. I'm going to try that. There's a certain brown look in that work that I want to get, somewhat. At the same time, I want to come away with it looking like someone today did it. Okay, that's 4 things. Well, I'm going to start moving in the direction of trying to sort of, well, I'm going to get that horse in some way. I'm going to get that rider. And I'm going to do something about the landscape. So that when I start to feel as if I've covered some of these points, I begin to think, well, I'm reaching near the end of the painting.
Several months ago, you yourself became a cultural expert. At the invitation of the Soviet Union, you visited there to talk to painters. Who invited you, and what did you do while you were there?
Well, I was actually invited by the State Department, meaning someone called me up and said, listen, the Russians would like to invite you to spend 2 weeks in the Soviet Union as a guest of the USA. But the USA stands for the Union of Soviet Artists. That they want me to be a guest of the Union of Soviet Artists. I would like to show you some letters that came to me, but I didn't think this question would come up. But I never found out who invited me. I never found out why I was invited. I never found anybody who really knew my work. I mean, what...
Do you think they confused that Russian Revolution painting?
Well, let me tell you what happened. No, there was one woman in Leningrad who had a photograph of me that was taken in some book called Beat Coast East. It was like a very down bohemian book. I mean, I don't know how she ever got a hold of it. And it was like at least 10 or 15 years old.
Well, I can't
and I'm playing
decide
piano. It had nothing to do with that.
if it was the Boston Massacre or Paul Revere's Peculiar
I thought
Ride
that.
or the
I thought-
Russian Revolution that inspired them.
Well, let me say one thing and give you a little hint. I was the second artist invited by them. The first one was Jamie Wyeth. So that is a little bit, I thought to myself, they think I'm a social, they think I'm a certain kind of realist, or that I do kinds of work which would make their art seem like it has some validity in Western painting, things like that, because they are very, very self-conscious. If I did a work in 1965 that was called The History of the Russian Revolution, and I thought, this is an unbelievable opportunity. I do the history of the Russian Revolution. I'm invited to Russia. I'm going to show them the history of the Russian Revolution. But everybody's dream has to then be countered with the reality of the situation. First of all, there's an interpreter everywhere you go. At one of the meetings in which I showed these works, there were 2 interpreters. For the first time, I realized that one of the interpreters would get up and say, he didn't mean that. He didn't say that. So that I'm wondering what was going on when I only had 1 interpreter. I got very unsure. I began to realize that to tell a joke, or like the lightheartedness in which I feel as if I have to talk about art, it was totally impossible. And so, but I did show this history of the Russian Revolution, and I wondered what kind, so I was asked, well, why did I do it? None of the questions were really controversial. There was only one thing in the work, two things in the work that possibly could have been controversial, and one was a portrait of Trotsky, and a kind of pointing to a thing called the Kronstadt incident, which was, there was a point at which the sailors mutinied in Kronstadt, and that the only living Bolshevik in Russia at the time of the revolution was, of course, Trotsky. So Trotsky, I think at that time, was the head of the armed forces, opted for lobbing some bombs in there. And this was later used by Stalin to show that he wasn't a real, aside from being Jewish, he wasn't a real patriot. And I told them that Trotsky played a very important part in the Russian Revolution, and that it was my understanding that he was a non-person here.
Did that make you a non-person there?
No, there was a lot of quiet. There was a lot of quiet. There was no, the only person that asked, it was very funny, the only person that asked questions, to every meeting I went to, there were journalists. And they were the ones that sort of got up and asked the question, because I am interested, in other words, I show my art, I'll talk about the art. They didn't seem to talk very much about that. But I was curious about the effect, politically, or whatever you would call that kind of situation. You come to show your art and to see what kind of splash you're going to make in relation to attitudes about the Soviet Union. I also showed a Japanese work that was taken during the Japanese period of sexual intercourse between 2 Asiatics. And it's a rather false rendition of the man's penis because of the convention in Japanese art to enlarge the man's penis. But at any rate, I showed these two works among a number of other works. Well, like, you know, a lot of quiet, and I made remarks and things like that, and the poor translator had to say, the woman had to say everything I said, or felt compelled to, and she would sort of be giggling, but no one else giggled. And finally, I get back to Moscow. I was in Leningrad, I was in Tashkent, I was in Bukhara, I was in Samarkand, I was all over. I get back to Moscow, and I'm called into the American Embassy, and speaking to the cultural attaché, Miss Johnson, and a very wonderful woman who made a meal, and I met some Soviet academicians who study American elections. It was a marvelous evening. And she said, you know, we're really playing right into the hands of the Russians. They do think America is a fairly degenerate country. And that the showing of those works really... Now, Larry, I know that you're an artist and that, you know, you don't tell artists what to show. I mean, I wouldn't be telling you what to show and everything like that. And I began to think to myself, I said, really, I'm not a kind of a political pain in the sense that I think that coming away from those works really makes you a better person, or that you really sort of, you know more, or that it's going to expand you, all this consciousness raising. I don't feel that kind of thing. And so when she said that to me, I thought to myself, well, what am I going to do? Shall I respond to Miss Johnson and say, look, Mrs. Johnson and America, don't tell me what to do. I was invited over here. I can show any goddamn thing I want. You know, was I going to respond to her, or was I going to really respond to the situation, which was that nobody got it? It didn't mean anything.
Did you ever expect your life to unfold the way it has?
I think that I acted as if I did. If you can read some of those journals that, I mean, when you think of some of the remarks that were made in the artist journals of the 19th century, or the poets' journals about, I mean, Baudelaire rising above, that the most important thing in his life was to be able to rise above those who he despises. I never forgot that remark. I thought it was so fantastic that you would devote yourself to becoming famous so that you could bring unhappiness to those who put you down. So I never forgot that. It seems that kind of romantic juxtaposition is something I did give myself, and I thought in those terms for quite a while. So, and I did think that, if you'll read some of the things that Frank O'Hara and I wrote, that like becoming aside from a suntan, becoming famous was the most important thing in life.
Thank you very much, Larry Rivers, for being with us. I'm Barbara Lee Diamonstein with Inside New York's Art World. Thank you very much.